現在の欧米メインストリームメディアは、ほんの一握りの巨大メディアコングロマレットに掌握されていて、ミリタリー・インダストリアル・コンプレックス、世界の軍産複合体とマルチナショナル・ジャイアント企業、ニオコロニアリズムを推し進める世界の大金持ちキャピタリストたち、そして彼らに支配されている欧米諸国政府のためのプロパガンダ機関だと言っても過言ではありません。また世界のニュースエージェンシー、AP 通信、ロイター、AFP なども実際には完全なインディペンデントとは言い切れません。日本のニュースは欧米メインストリームメディアの記事をそのまま伝えているだけですから、欧米プロパガンダの横流しです。この動画では、世界中の大きな勢力と戦い、嫌がらせや圧力にも負けず、欧米諸国の経済やジオポリティカルな利益のための報道ではなく、欧米諸国の支配から今も抜け出せずにいる国々が真に欧米諸国から独立できるよう応援し、私たちに真実を伝えようとしてくれている世界の真の本物のジャーナリストたちの声をご紹介いたします。まず、アメリカ政府とアメリカを牛耳っている権力者たちを総称して US エンパイアと呼ぶことにします。US エンパイアはスペインから植民地の中南米の国々を奪って以来ずっと US エンパイアの裏庭として利用してきました。中南米で起こるソーシャリズムムーブメントを武力で抑え、潰し続けてきたのは US エンパイアの利益のためという事実は言うまでもありません。ところがキューバとベネズエラには未だに苦戦しています。そのためキューバとベネズエラに対しては絶えず US エンパイアによる政権打倒のクーデターが試みられています。2021年7月11日、そして11月15日、Right-Wing Counter-Revolutionary たちによるプロテストが仕掛けられました。幸い US エンパイアの試みは失敗に終わりましたが、その巧妙な手口によって世界は騙されてしまっています。
The protest didn't last long, but outside Cuba, the news story kept going.
Continuous protests and demonstrations in South Florida.
This is a scene at Versailles near Calle 8.
Para mañana está prevista otra manifestación.
Si Cuba está en la calle, Miami también.
People in Miami went crazy. And in DC, Biden decided to increase sanctions against Cuba. As usual, what is said in Miami and DC está lejos de nuestra realidad aquí en Cuba.
This CNN article heavily implies that the people in this photo are in Cuba. But people were quick to point out that the street sign in the photo is from Miami. One of the protesters is even wearing a MAGA hat. A bunch of mainstream outlets took it a step further by posting a picture of a pro-government demonstration but captioning it saying it was an anti-government demonstration. You can tell they support the government because they're waving flags that say July 26th, the day Fidel Castro and his guerrilla army launched its first attacks against the Batista regime. Only people who support the Cuban government celebrate this day. There were also several social media accounts posting videos of huge marches in other countries claiming they were videos from Cuba. Here's a video of a march in Buenos Aires that people were claiming took place in Cuba. And speaking of social media accounts, what's up with all these accounts with 0 followers, all created in the last few months, that have all of a sudden taken up an interest in Cuba? One Twitter user did an in-depth analysis of over 2 million tweets that used the hashtag SOSCuba. He found that the first account to use the hashtag was one of these accounts with a name and a string of numbers. When the protests really started to pick up steam on July 10th and July 11th, this account was tweeting at a rate of 5 tweets a second. One of the most important tweets in the spam campaign was this tweet calling on people to tag popular musicians with the hashtag SOSCuba. Almost all of the accounts participating in this campaign were created during the protests. During the 2019 coup of Evo Morales' government, there were at least 68,000 fake accounts spamming anti-socialist and anti-Evo tweets. There was an almost identical bot campaign against the Nicaraguan government in 2018. It's public knowledge that the US attempted to assassinate the leader of the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro, over 600 times. The failed plot began with the US bombing Cuba and then inserting 1,500 Cuban exiles, armed and combat trained by the United States, onto the island to instigate an insurrection against the Cuban government. The US flirted with even more egregious plots like this one to blow up their own ships and blame it on the Cubans to recreate an incident similar to the one that pushed the US into war with Spain in 1898, or this idea to detonate plastic explosives in the Miami area and call it a Cuban terrorist attack. It's not just ancient history, though. The most recent appropriations budget allocated $20 million for Cuban democracy programs. Of course, the type of democracy the US is talking about is the same democracy they dropped on Iraq. They're talking about regime change. These democracy programs include things like radio and TV Marti, which are US government media outlets that broadcast anti-government messages from Miami to Cuba. The US has also sent spies who posed as HIV prevention workers to Cuba to incite rebellion. Under the guise of humanitarianism, these workers would identify local community leaders and try to convince them to lead a rebellion against the Cuban government. Look at a pro-government demonstration. Right now, the mainstream media is refusing to show the videos of thousands of pro-government Cubans demonstrating their continued support for the government over the last week. Ultimately, these outlets are never going to tell the truth about Cuba because they're owned by billionaires who hate everything the Cuban Socialist Project represents. And the same goes for the US political establishment. So the onus is really on us to study Cuba and expose the lies. I also want to shout out to Twitter users who compiled a lot of the information I presented in this video. We need more people to do this kind of work because the only way we're going to end the blockade and the criminal attacks on Cuba is by exposing the methods and motives of the attackers, and to make it so unpopular and egregious for anyone to continue to support the US's anti-Cuba policy that the US is forced to change.
ソーシャルメディアでハッシュタグ SOS キューバを拡散し、ミュージシャンのラッパーグループを使って若者にアンタイソーシャリズムを洗脳。同時にメインストリームメディアはフェイクフォトを使って堂々と誤報を広めます。CIA によって計画コーディネートされた US エンパイアのレジームチェンジオペレーションがいかに巧妙にタイムリーに全てが一体化するよう仕組まれているのかをこちらのインディペンデントメディアグレイゾーンも説明しています。
Backed by the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID, with these figures who kind of speak intersectional or academic language, some of that you talked about the Pachakutik party in Ecuador, who are an indigenous party that basically sabotaged the socialist candidate in Ecuador and formed a de facto alliance with a banker, Guillermo Lasso. You have the MRS party in Nicaragua where you are. They're no longer called the MRS, but they posed as the real Sandinistas while they aligned themselves in the 2006 election with Eduardo Montealegre, another right-wing banker. But they pose as feminists who are for abortion rights and so on, and all of them are lining their pockets with USAID money. And then here we have in Cuba rappers, artists, cultural figures who in the US would be regarded as sort of like they would be loved at any warehouse in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and regarded as fellow avant-garde progressive travelers. But then when you listen to what they say in Spanish, they're supporting Trump, they're supporting a brutal blockade of Cuba. They are not just kind of critics of the government calling for artistic freedom, but they're essentially calling for regime change, and they're launching these performances which U.S. media never reports on in the heart of Old Havana, where they're deliberately trying to create friction and confrontation with the Cuban state. And these are Gene Sharp tactics to kind of expose it as authoritarian and then have human rights groups come in and wag their fingers and then generate sanctions. So one of the performances, if you scroll down, you'll see a bunch of youth running through Old Havana with American flags. And this is a performance launched by the coordinator of the San Isidro movement, the US-backed collective of Cuban artists and rappers. There he is right there. If you go up a little bit, you'll see that is Luis Miguel Otero Alcantara. And he's, first of all, this is a performance. This is his performance art. He's taking a shit with the Cuban flag on, which is really offensive to people in Cuba who are very nationalistic, because nationalism is kind of what gives them the strength to resist this all-encompassing 60-year siege. Latin American influencers. So they're basically trying to get influencers to speak out for this color revolution, and Twitter is not intervening as they do. You know how when they flush out Russian or Syrian bots and the DFR lab will make the attribution. That's not happening here. So we're going to probably
because Twitter is an arm of the U.S. government, and we talk about it all the time. Twitter, all these big tech social media corporations are just arms of U.S. soft power. They do exactly what the U.S. government want, or in the case of Palestine, they do exactly what the Israeli government wants, censoring and deleting the accounts of Palestinian activists. I mean, the Guardian of Blairism, the major, the top British newspaper, they have been posting these photos, and here you can see it. The photo says, anti-government protesters gather at the Mahimo Gomez Monument in Havana on Sunday. And you can see here that in this supposed photo of anti-government protesters, there are people holding the July 26th flag. This is the flag used by Fidel Castro's movement during the revolution. It was called the July 26th movement against the US-backed Batista dictatorship. These are people using the flag that symbolizes support for the revolution and support for the government. And The Guardian is publishing blatantly fake news, claiming that this protest, this demonstration of people who are supporting the government are supposedly against the government. And they weren't the only outlet. There's also this outlet here, El Nuevo Dia, which is a corporate outlet in Puerto Rico, a U.S. colony, which is actually suffering egregiously under COVID and under privatization of electrical grid and the aftermath of the hurricane. And of course, the U.S. media never talks about the horrors that Puerto Ricans suffer under. And a lot of Puerto Ricans on social media have been talking about the irony that everyone's talking about Cuba and all the corporate media outlets, and no one talks about the suffering that they're going through now with all these blackouts caused by the U.S., the junta, the dictatorship imposed on the colony of Puerto Rico, forcing the privatization of their electrical grid, and now there's all these rolling blackouts. But meanwhile, the Puerto Rican corporate media is also using these photos of pro-government rallies in Cuba and claiming that they're examples of protests against the government. I mean, we're talking about blatant fake news. This is like a textbook example of a psyop. This is information warfare, sending out fake news to try to make people think there's some kind of big uprising, they're calling it a revolution. It's, by definition, it's an attempted counter-revolution in Cuba, and they're spreading all this fake news, and it's not even like good fake news. Here's another example here I was talking about of, it looks like finally this Peruvian right-wing politician deleted the tweet, but here you can see on the left, there are all these bot accounts tweeting this photo, and you can clearly see the Egyptian flags here.
US エンパイアによる経済制裁という名の虐待が罪のない一般のキューバ国民を苦しめ、そして苦しめられた国民の怒りをキューバ政府へと誘導します。すべて US エンパイアのレジームチェンジオペレーションの一環です。
They say the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support in Cuba is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. And then it says, it follows that every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba in order to make the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. That is the explicitly stated goal of the U.S. blockade. To this day, it's the same exact goal, and it's something that Max spelled out in an article that he published at the Grayzone, that in which an envoy, a top U.S. government envoy on Iran, bragged in his book, The Art of Sanctions, about depriving Iranian civilians of food and medicine. That's the explicitly stated goal. They admit it in their own internal documents and in their own books. Of course, no one reads them, and the corporate media never talks about it. But we're talking about that when the U.S. government, through these dumb statements like we saw from Biden and Jen Psaki, claims that there's supposedly mismanagement in Cuba, that's of course a ridiculous euphemism. What they're boasting of is that they created economic hardship. In their words, they created hunger, desperation, and economic dissatisfaction and hardship. That is their explicitly stated goal. And all
こちらはインディペンデントジャーナリストアビー・マーティンのドキュメンタリーです。 2019年、US エンパイアがグアイドを使ってベネズエラのマドゥーロ政権を転覆させようとした時と全く同じ手口で、キューバでも水面下で何年も費やしながらレジュームチェンジオペレーションを行っていたことを暴露したものです。インタビューを受けているのはアメリカ CIA によってキューバのグアイドのようにアメリカバックの大統領に任命された人物。実は彼はダブルエージェントでした。CIA の下での彼の任務が明らかにされています。
Remember Juan Guaido, the unknown nobody Venezuelan politician who declared himself president as part of Trump's failed regime change operation? Well, that wasn't the first time it was tried. This is a playbook the US has in its arsenal for several countries targeted for overthrow, including Cuba. This CIA story will help you understand what we're witnessing today in Cuba, where the Biden administration has initiated its own regime change operation, using protests to slap more sanctions on the island and saying that delivering democracy is their, quote, top priority. You can't properly see what's happening in Cuba without understanding how the CIA has constantly worked to overthrow the government, possibly more than any other country in the world. We normally don't get to see the inside of these plans, but this story gives us a rare and fascinating window because it comes from one of the agency's top Cuban operatives. In 2004, university professor Raul Capote was recruited by the CIA to help overthrow the Cuban government. But unbeknownst to them, he was a double agent reporting to Cuban intelligence the whole time. For 7 years, Raul played the CIA and became their most trusted agent in the country. He was even recruited to be the new president. His story about how he was supposed to come to power has eerie parallels to what began on July 11th, 2021.
La semejanza entre lo que ha sucedido con Juan Guaidó y su autoproclamación y los sucesos anteriores y posteriores se parece mucho al proyecto en el que yo trabajé durante muchos años, un proyecto de la CIA para Cuba, que comenzó en el año 2004, o sea, comenzó con mucha antelación a cuánto debía ocurrir. Entonces son cosas que se preparan siempre con mucho cuidado, con mucho tiempo antes. El proyecto Génesis, que fue el proyecto de la CIA para Cuba, incluía la formación de líderes. Primero la selección en las universidades y después la formación, la preparación de líderes. Preparación de líderes que tenían previsto hacerlo en un plazo de 10 a 15 años. Ese proyecto Génesis incluía que llegado el momento idóneo para Cuba, según los planes del gobierno estadounidense, en un transcurso de 10 años o 15 años, en un momento que estuviera ocurriendo un cambio de generación en Cuba, que estuvieran previstas elecciones para la presidencia del Consejo de Estado y el Consejo de Ministros, que debe estar ocurriendo un relevo generacional, como ellos estimaban, que debe estar sucediendo en un periodo de ya 15 años, donde incluso ya ellos calculaban que Fidel Castro, comandante en jefe de la Revolución Cubana, no estaría vivo o por lo menos en condiciones de dirigir el país, y calculaban también que no estuvieran presentes muchos de los líderes históricos de la Revolución Cubana, y una nueva generación de cubanos debería estar en ese momento asumiendo responsabilidades e importancia en el país. En ese contexto, todos estos líderes formados en planes de becas, en planes de intercambio académico, como ha ocurrido con muchos de los líderes que hoy en el mundo entero responden a los intereses del gobierno norteamericano. Hay muchos líderes hoy de la derecha, y no solamente líderes políticos, incluso académicos, incluso líderes que tienen en diferentes escenarios de la economía, o sea, empresarios, que han sido formados en este tipo de proyectos, en estos planes de formación que hacen dentro de Estados Unidos y en Europa. Muchos de ellos han pasado por cursos de liderazgo, y en el caso de Cuba estaban haciendo exactamente lo mismo, o sea, preparar líderes para este momento de cambio en el país. Y en ese escenario en el que se debía estar celebrando elecciones en Cuba, debía salir a la luz pública una organización, una supuesta organización no gubernamental inicialmente, que debía proyectarse el escenario cubano como una organización de nuevo tipo, una organización de cambio en el país. A la contrarrevolución de Miami, a los líderes de la contrarrevolución de Miami, me decían que eso era un proyecto puramente norteamericano, que era un proyecto estadounidense. ¿Qué pasa? Que ese proyecto no ha resultado, porque ciertamente, aunque era un plan secreto, a nosotros nos asombra mucho que ellos tienen previsto hacerlo. O sea, el golpe iba a ocurrir el día 13 de agosto, si es del cumpleaños de Fidel. Pero un día antes, la prensa de Miami y la radio en Miami, los canales de televisión de Miami, comienzan a hablar de que va a ocurrir un levantamiento popular en Cuba. Eso no debía pasarse, según el plan eso no debía saberse. Y empiezan a decir que hay una persona en Centro Habana que está dispuesta a inmolarse por la democracia. Y empiezan a usar constantemente la palabra inmolarse. Y Darcy Ferrer, que es la persona que está a cargo de esta misión, nadie le ha dicho que tenía que inmolarse. Pero además estaban casi que creando la imagen de que va a ocurrir una muerte, de que va a ocurrir un crimen, de que, por supuesto, para culpar al gobierno cubano de lo que ocurriera. Y parece que Darcy, por lo que yo pude saber después, Darcy parece que tiene miedo en ese momento de que ciertamente lo vayan a matar, que la misma CIA lo vaya a matar, o vaya a ocurrir un fenómeno de este nivel que sirva como pretexto para fortalecer lo que iba a hacer yo después de llamar a la intervención norteamericana.
こちらは1962年、ケネディが大統領だった時に US エンパイアと CIA が計画していた False Flag Operation について説明しています。キューバ国内での民間人を標的としたテロ攻撃を行うだけでなく、アメリカ海軍艦艇やアメリカ軍用機を自ら爆破し、キューバ政府のせいにしようとする被害者演出テロ攻撃です。もちろん理由はキューバ侵略のための軍事介入を正当化するため、そしてキューバの国際的イメージを悪化させ、世界を納得させ、アメリカ国民からキューバ侵略の支持を得るためです。
Years after the Cuban Revolution, in which they were going to carry out terror attacks on civilian targets in Cuba, and also in the United States, by the way, and then blame that on Cuba and claim that the Cuban revolutionary government was responsible for these attacks, and then use that as justification for military intervention, for an invasion of Cuba. Here she looks at another document, proposes acts of terrorism to be carried out by the CIA and other U.S. agencies against U.S. targets and also Cuban targets, and both military and civilian targets, and then blaming them on the Cuban government. These are the classified documents right here. I mean, the U.S. government admitting that it wants to carry out these terror attacks and then hurt Cuba's international image, claiming that Cuba is a crazy country that has to be isolated. Now I want to read a brief part of this. The potential terrorist attacks that the CIA and the U.S. military were discussing to carry out inside Cuba. Starting rumors, now that's common, capturing Cubans, capturing saboteurs in both the U.S. and in Cuba, and blaming on Cuba. Blowing up ammunition inside the base, which starts fires. Burning aircraft on the airbase, sabotage. These are U.S. aircraft. So the U.S. was talking about burning its own aircraft and then blaming it on Cuba. Lobbing mortar shells from outside of the base into the base, causing damage to military installations. Capturing assault teams approaching from the sea. Capture a militia group which storms the base. Sabotaging a ship in the harbor, causing large fires. Sinking ships near the harbor. The United States would respond by executing offensive operations to secure water and power supplies, destroying Cuban artillery and mortar emplacements which threatened the base, which would then commence large-scale United States military operations. So, discussing a, quote, remember the Maine incident, which could be arranged in several forms. We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. We could blow up a drone, an unmanned vessel, anywhere in the Cuban waters. We could arrange to cause such an incident in the vicinity of Havana, the capital, or Santiago of Cuba, as a spectacular result of a Cuban attack from the air or sea or both. The presence of Cuban planes or ships merely investigating the intent of the vessel could be fairly compelling evidence that the ship was taken under attack. The nearness to the capital Havana or Santiago would add credibility, especially to those people that might have heard the blast or have seen the fire. The U.S. could then follow up with an air-sea rescue operation covered by U.S. fighters to, quote, evacuate remaining members of the non-existent crew. Casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, or in Florida cities, or even in Washington. This is the CIA admitting openly that they wanted to attack their own military base, their own civilians, and then use the media making fake casualty lists to spread fake news to make Americans angry, North Americans angry, so they could justify an invasion of Cuba. This is the CIA admitting openly that it does false flag attacks, that it kills civilians, or in some cases pretends to kill people and then falsely blames governments. If you think the U.S. hasn't done this since 1962, I'm sorry, you're high. You're extremely naive. This is exactly the kind of thing that the U.S. government does, that the CIA does.
2021年11月、ニカラグアで国政選挙が行われました。US エンパイアは中南米でレフティストの政府が選ばれるたび、選挙に不正があっただの、独裁者だのとクレームをつけます。そして政権転覆できないときにはさらなる経済制裁を課します。ニカラグアにもさらなる経済制裁が課されました。US エンパイアが世界中で行っている弱い者いじめの実態を知るために、どうぞ説明欄のリンク先をご参照ください。